Welcome to the Nonfiction Insights channel. Today we're diving deep into a book you recommended, Why Nations Fail, by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson.
That's right.
You were curious about why some countries are wealthy and others aren't, right? Well, this book throws out a lot of the usual explanations and lands on something surprisingly fundamental, the rules of the game.
Exactly. This book has gotten a lot of attention for challenging conventional wisdom. Forget location, forget culture. Acemoglu and Robinson argue it's the institutions, the political and economic structures a society builds that are the real engines of prosperity, or the anchors of poverty.
Okay, institutions. That sounds a bit abstract. So our mission today is to make that concrete. We're going to look at the core concepts, see how they play out in history, and maybe even poke a few holes in the theory, or at least look at some of its nuances. Let's start with the basics. What exactly do they mean by these institutions that hold so much power?
Well, at its heart, the book argues that a nation's fate isn't really tied to its geography or, the inherent traits of its people, or even the brilliance or lack thereof of its leaders. Instead, it's the framework of rules, norms, and organizations that shape how a society operates its institutions. These can either pave the way for widespread opportunity and progress, or they can stifle it by concentrating power and wealth in the hands of just a few.
So if a country's struggling, the book suggests we shouldn't immediately blame its natural resources or its cultural values. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. And they dedicate a good chunk of the book early on to dismantling those very arguments. They present evidence that suggests these factors just don't hold up when you look at the complexities of global inequality.
Okay.
The core of their argument is that the choices societies make about how they organize themselves politically and economically are what truly matter.
Choices about organization. Okay, let's get specific then.
Yep.
What are the two main types of institutions they talk about that have such dramatically different outcomes?
So, the central dichotomy in Why Nations Fail is between what the authors call inclusive and extractive institutions. Inclusive institutions basically aim to create a level playing field where lots of people can participate in the economy and have a voice in political decision-making.
Right.
Extractive institutions, on the other hand, are set up to benefit a narrow elite who, well, extract wealth and power from the rest of society.
Level playing field versus rigged game. That's a pretty clear contrast. Let's dig into the inclusive side first. What are the key characteristics of inclusive economic institutions? What does a country with these kinds of institutions look like in practice?
Think of it like this. In a society with inclusive economic institutions, you'd typically see strong protections for private property. People need to be confident that if they work hard and acquire assets, those assets won't just be arbitrarily taken away,
Yes, security.
Right. You'd also see a robust rule of law, where contracts are enforced, and the legal system is, well, fair and predictable for pretty much everyone. Crucially, these institutions allow for broad participation in economic activities.
Meaning
People are free to start businesses, choose their professions, access education and training, compete in the marketplace. Often, a strong, centralized state is needed to enforce these rules and provide essential public services like infrastructure and security that benefit everyone.
So it's about creating an environment where individuals feel secure enough to invest and innovate, knowing they'll reap the rewards of their efforts. Now, how do inclusive political institutions fit into this? It sounds like they kind of lay the groundwork.
Exactly. Inclusive political institutions are about the distribution and limitations of political power. The authors highlight two key ingredients. First, a sufficiently centralized state that can actually enforce laws and provide order.
Okay.
And second, what they call pluralism, meaning that political power is broadly distributed, preventing any single group from becoming too dominant.
Pluralism, right.
When power is dispersed and there are checks and balances in place, it's much harder for a narrow elite to hijack the system for their own benefit and create those extractive economic institutions. These political structures ensure accountability and responsiveness to a wider range of societal interests.
So you need both a state that's strong enough to maintain order and a system that prevents that state from becoming a tool of oppression for a select few. Makes sense. Now let's flip to the dark side. Extractive institutions. What are the hallmarks of extractive economic institutions?
Extractive economic institutions are essentially designed to do the opposite of inclusive ones. They concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a small elite.
Okay.
So instead of secure property rights for everyone, you'll likely see that the elite have strong protections, while the majority are vulnerable to having their assets seized. The rule of law tends to be selectively, favoring the powerful.
Rigged game, like you said.
Exactly. Markets are often rigged to benefit the elite, with high barriers to entry for anyone trying to compete. The whole system is just geared towards extracting resources from the rest of society to enrich those in control.
And these extractive economic systems don't exist in a vacuum, do they? The book argues they're deeply connected to a particular kind of political system.
Absolutely. Extractive economic institutions almost always go hand in hand with extractive political institutions. These are characterized by a concentration of political power in the hands of a narrow elite, with very few constraints on what they can do.
Hmm.
This political dominance allows them to shape the economic rules to their advantage, extract resources, and maintain their grip on power. It's a self-reinforcing cycle.
Hmm.
Extractive political institutions lead to extractive economic institutions, which generate wealth for the elite, who then use that wealth to solidify their political control. This vicious circle is a key reason why some countries seem trapped in poverty.
That makes the persistence of poverty seem less like a mystery and more like a consequence of, well, deliberate choices made by those in power. The book uses a lot of compelling historical examples to illustrate these concepts. Let's start with the famous tale of the two Nogales.
Ah, yes. The story of Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora is almost a perfect natural experiment, isn't it?
It really is.
They share the same geography, the same culture, even the same family split by a border. Yet the economic outcomes are vastly different. The book argues that the key difference is the institutions.
Right.
Nogales, Arizona benefits from the history of more inclusive economic and political institutions in the United States, offering its residents opportunities, secure property rights, and a degree of democratic accountability. Nogales, Sonora, on the other hand, is shaped by Mexico's history of more extractive institutions, leading to less opportunity and less security. The stark contrast across a simple border really highlights the power of these underlying structures.
It really isolates the variable of national institutions, doesn't it? What about the different approaches of colonial powers in the Americas? That also seems like a pivotal set of historical events they discuss.
Yeah, the contrasting colonial experiences are incredibly insightful. The Spanish conquest in regions like, say, modern-day Colombia and Peru was primarily focused on extracting wealth, gold, silver, and labor from the indigenous populations. They established institutions like the encomienda that essentially granted conquistadors control over land and labor with little regard for the rights or well-being of the native people. The aim was just to enrich the Spanish crown and the colonizers.
Pure abstraction.
Pure extraction. In contrast, the early English attempts at similar extractive models in North America, like in Jamestown, faced a different reality. Settlers had more options. They weren't dealing with a large, easily controlled indigenous population in the same way.
Right, different context.
Exactly. So they demanded more rights and economic freedom, eventually leading to the development of more inclusive institutions, culminating in things like the General Assembly in Jamestown in 1619.
So the initial power dynamics and the ability of different groups to push for their rights really set these two colonial trajectories on vastly different paths, ultimately impacting their long-term institutional development. The book emphasizes how the U.S. Constitution, for all its flaws, was a step towards limiting power, while post-independence Mexico kind of struggled with entrenched elites.
Exactly right. While the U.S. Constitution, born out of a struggle for greater representation and limitations on power, laid a foundation for more inclusive political and economic institutions, the elites in many parts of Latin America, including Mexico after independence, largely maintained the extractive structures that had benefited them under colonial rule.
They didn't want to give up power.
Pretty much. They were resistant to reforms that would broadly distribute power and opportunity. This divergence in political development had profound and lasting consequences for economic prosperity in both regions.
The Industrial Revolution in England is another key example the book uses, showing how inclusive institutions can fuel economic progress. How did that happen according to them?
Well, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England is often seen as a critical juncture. It significantly limited the power of the monarchy and strengthened Parliament, leading to greater security of property rights and a more predictable legal system.
Okay.
These more inclusive political institutions created an environment that was much more conducive to innovation and investment. When inventors like James Watt could secure patents for their steam engines through acts of Parliament, they had the incentive to develop and commercialize new technologies, driving economic growth.
And the book contrasts this with the Ottoman Empire during a similar period. Why did innovation seem to lag there?
Yeah, the Ottoman Empire, with its highly centralized and absolutist rule, feared the destabilizing effects of new technologies and ideas, what the authors call creative destruction.
Ah, creative destruction.
Yeah. The slow adoption of the printing press is a classic example they cite. The ruling elite worried that the spread of information could undermine their authority. This fear of disruption, which is sort of inherent in extractive political systems, stifled the kind of innovation that was flourishing in England under its more inclusive institutional framework.
That makes sense. The stark contrast between North and South Korea after their division is another really powerful illustration of the book's central thesis, isn't it? Same people, same geography, completely different outcomes.
Absolutely. It's almost hard to believe. Divided after World War II and following very different political and economic paths, North and South Korea offer a compelling, if tragic, real-world experiment. South Korea, despite initial challenges, gradually developed economic institutions that encouraged investment, trade, and education, leading to remarkable economic growth.
The Korean miracle.
Right. North Korea, under a rigid, centrally planned, and politically repressive regime with basically no private property rights or free markets, has experienced economic stagnation and even decline. The dramatic difference in prosperity is overwhelmingly attributed to their divergent institutions, not to any inherent differences in their people or their land.
It's a stark example. The authors even address cases where you see some economic growth under seemingly extractive regimes, like the Soviet Union's rapid industrialization under Stalin. But they argue this kind of growth has inherent limitations. Why?
Right. They tackle that head on. While the Soviet Union did achieve rapid industrialization in the early to mid-20th century through the forceful allocation of resources.
Moving people around, dictating production.
Exactly. But the authors argue that this type of growth is ultimately unsustainable. It relies on, well, brute force mobilization of resources and labor, rather than on the innovation and creative destruction that drive long-term economic progress under inclusive institutions. Without secure property rights, free markets, and political accountability, there's just no mechanism to foster the continuous innovation and widespread participation needed for sustained development. The system eventually hits a ceiling, basically.
The book also discusses how major historical turning points, like the Black Death in the 14th century, could have radically different consequences depending on the existing institutional landscape. That's fascinating.
It really is. The Black Death, a devastating pandemic, created a huge labor shortage across Europe. In Western Europe, this actually empowered peasants and weakened the feudal system, contributing to a long-term shift towards more inclusive institutions. Labor became more valuable.
So the plague actually helped level the playing field, in a way.
In Western Europe, yes, to some extent. However, in Eastern Europe, where the existing power of the landed aristocracy was stronger, the response was the opposite. They further entrenched serfdom and limited the mobility of labor, a clear move towards more extractive institutions. So the same critical juncture had opposite institutional effects because of the pre-existing power dynamics and institutional differences.
That really underscores the idea of path dependence. And what about the reversal of fortune in the Americas? The fact that regions that were relatively prosperous before European colonization are now often poorer than those that were less developed. How does the book explain that through the lens of institutions?
This is a fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive observation they make. The authors argue that the European colonizers established the most extractive institutions in the regions that were already wealthy and densely populated, like Mexico and Peru. Why? Because it was easier to control and exploit the existing labor force and resources there.
So the wealth was actually a curse, institutionally speaking.
In a way, yes. In contrast, in the less developed regions, like parts of North America where there wasn't a large indigenous population to exploit in the same manner, the settlers themselves often demanded more rights and a greater say in how things were run. This pressure led to the development of relatively more inclusive institutions over time. So the initial wealth actually became a disadvantage in terms of long-term institutional development.
That's a really interesting twist. Finally, this idea of the fear of creative destruction seems like a recurring theme in the context of extractive institutions. Why is that such a powerful barrier to progress?
Well, creative destruction is the engine of economic growth, right? It's the process by which new technologies and more efficient ways of doing things replace old ones. However, this process inevitably disrupts existing power structures.
Yeah, people lose jobs, industries change.
Exactly. And it can lead to social upheaval. In societies with extractive institutions, the elite often fear this disruption because it can threaten their economic privileges and their political control. So they might actively resist innovation to maintain the status quo, even if it means hindering overall economic progress for the country.
Like blocking new machines.
Yeah, the example they use of Queen Elizabeth I's initial reluctance towards William Lee's stocking frame knitting machine, fearing unemployment among hand knitters and potential political instability, illustrates this tension perfectly. The elite prioritize stability and their own position over broader progress.
This framework provides a really compelling way to look at global inequality. But are there any limitations or criticisms of this purely institutional view that the book itself acknowledges or that are worth considering? Let's move into a bit of a critical review.
Yeah, definitely. While Why Nations Fail presents a powerful and, I think, persuasive argument, the authors themselves acknowledge that the picture isn't always black and white. For instance, they point out that even some regimes with fundamentally extractive political institutions can experience periods of economic growth.
Like the Soviet example again.
Exactly, or even modern China to some extent, though that's complex. This can happen particularly if the elite feels secure enough to allow certain inclusive economic developments that don't immediately threaten their core power. However, the authors are quick to emphasize that this kind of growth tends to be unsustainable in the long run, precisely because it lacks the innovative engine fueled by political inclusivity and true creative destruction.
So it's not a rigid rule that extractive institutions always lead to immediate stagnation. There can be short bursts of progress under the right or perhaps wrong circumstances.
Exactly. It's more about the long-term trajectory and sustainability. And the authors also highlight the crucial role of historical contingency. Small differences in initial conditions interacting with significant historical events, those critical junctures we talked about, can lead to vastly different institutional paths.
Like the Black Death responses.
Precisely. The contrasting responses to the Black Death are a prime example. The specific ways in which societies navigate these turning points, based on their existing structures and power balances, can have profound and long-lasting effects on their institutional trajectories. The failure of absolutism in England, influenced by factors like the rise of a merchant class empowered by Atlantic trade, also demonstrates how specific historical circumstances can shape institutional development in ways that aren't purely deterministic.
Okay. Now, the book is quite critical of other explanations for poverty, like geography and culture. Have these criticisms faced any pushback, or are there nuances to those arguments that the authors might, gloss over a bit?
Well, Acemoglu and Robinson directly challenge the idea that geography or culture are primary drivers of poverty, and they provide substantial evidence to support their argument. They show, pretty convincingly I think, that countries with similar geographical conditions or cultural backgrounds can have vastly different levels of prosperity due to their institutions. Think again of the Koreas or Nogales.
Right, those comparisons are powerful.
They argue that often these factors like geography or culture are used as convenient scapegoats when the real issues lie in the political and economic structures. Regarding the ignorance hypothesis, the idea that poor countries are poor just because their leaders don't know any better, the authors contend that actually those in power often do know better, but they make choices that benefit themselves, even if it harms the broader population.
Deliberate choices, not mistakes.
That's their core argument. The example they give of Ghana's Prime Minister Kofi Busia, who apparently faced significant political obstacles from vested interests when trying to implement sound economic advice, supports this view that it's often politics, not ignorance, driving bad policy.
Finally, the book offers a somewhat pessimistic view, doesn't it, on the ability of external actors to just engineer prosperity in countries with deeply entrenched extractive institutions through things like foreign aid. What's their reasoning there?
Yeah, their argument is basically this. If the fundamental problem is that a narrow elite benefits from the existing extractive system, then simply injecting aid or offering policy advice from the outside is unlikely to create lasting change. Why? Because those efforts often fail, because the underlying power structures remain intact.
The system just absorbs or diverts the aid?
Or actively subverts it. The elite can undermine well-intentioned interventions if they threaten their control. The author suggests that sustainable change typically requires internal forces, a broad-based movement within the society itself, to challenge the existing power structures and build more inclusive political institutions from the ground up.
A domestic push for change.
Yes, and they acknowledge this is often a messy, difficult, and politically charged process, sometimes involving significant social upheaval. But they see it as the most likely path to fundamental transformation. The gradual development of more inclusive institutions in Brazil since the 1970s is offered as a perhaps hopeful, albeit complex, example of such an internal transformation. They also emphasize the vital role of things like a free press and an informed citizenry in demanding and achieving such reforms.
So it really boils down to empowering societies to change from within rather than relying on external saviors. That's a powerful and perhaps challenging conclusion for how we think about global development, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It shifts the focus from simply providing resources or technical fixes to addressing the fundamental power structures and political dynamics within a society. Why Nations Fail provides a really thought-provoking framework for understanding why some nations thrive and others don't, even if it doesn't offer easy solutions.
Absolutely. So as we've explored today, Why Nations Fail presents a compelling case that the primary drivers of global inequality aren't really about where a country is located or the inherent characteristics of its people, but rather the nature of its political and economic institutions, whether they are inclusive, fostering broad participation and opportunity, or extractive, concentrating power and wealth in the hands of a few. The historical examples vividly illustrate this argument, showing how different institutional paths can lead to dramatically different outcomes in terms of prosperity and poverty.
What really strikes me, thinking about it, is the deep interconnectedness they draw between political and economic freedom. The book makes such a strong case that sustained economic success isn't just about markets. It's deeply intertwined with having political systems that are accountable, pluralistic, and representative. It really makes you think about the underlying rules shaping opportunity or lack thereof in any society, including our own.
That's a great point. We hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights into this important book and perhaps a new lens through which to view global disparities. Why Nations Fail is absolutely packed with even more detail and fascinating case studies, so we definitely encourage you to explore it further if this discussion has sparked your interest.
It's a dense read, but worth it.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us on Nonfiction Insights. Please subscribe to the Nonfiction Insights channel for more in-depth explorations of thought-provoking books.